Welcome to Canantel 420, where every cultivar breakdown is built on verifiable structure, not recycled storytelling. This material is educational, compliant, and designed for an adult audience operating inside legal jurisdictions. We do not promote unregulated commerce, and we do not frame cannabis as medicine or recreation outside the regulatory language that governs those definitions. Everything you hear is rooted in agricultural reality, market documentation, and chemical profiling, not hype-driven rumor. With that clarity in place, we begin our number 8 entry in the top 10 cultivar series, Runts. To understand why this cultivar changed the trajectory of designer hybrids, we must start with the genetic decision that formed it, the people who controlled its release, and the cultural environment that allowed it to detonate rather than trickle into existence. Runts is the direct fusion of Skittles and gelato. That statement is not marketing shorthand, but a literal breeding event carried out by a small group of operators who understood that lineage alone would not generate impact without coordinated launch strategy. Skittles had already become one of the most chemically expressive cultivars of its period, producing unmistakable candy-forward terpenes, deep resin formation, and a sensory profile that stood apart from the earthy, fuel-heavy genetics of the 2000s. Gelato, developed inside the same extended ecosystem that produced Sunset Sherbet, Thin Mint, and the Cookie line, carried balanced hybrid architecture, dense trichome stacking, and high THC expression that repeatedly tested above standardized potency baselines. The Runts team did not create a random hybrid to see what happened. They engineered a genetic collision between two cultivars already associated with high terpene concentration and premium retail placement, then built the release strategy backwards from that outcome. The individuals responsible did not position themselves as anonymous growers. They embedded their identities into the brand, aligning music culture, street credibility, and emerging legal influence before adult use legalization fully stabilized in the Western United States. The first controlled appearance of Runts did not unfold quietly. It arrived at a major California cannabis exhibition with fully printed packaging, unified visual identity, and intentional product scarcity. Only a few pounds were distributed that day, accompanied by branded apparel and a coordinated presence inside a venue where every influential buyer, reviewer, and cultivator in the state was walking the floor. This matters because most cultivars rise slowly, gaining reputational weight only after years of phenotype-driven distribution. Runts had no such growth curve. It appeared as a finished consumer product the same day the public first heard its name, and that deliberate launch strategy achieved two effects at once. First, it created a psychological lock between the name, the flavor expectation, and the visual identity. Second, it prevented competing breeder groups from rewriting the origin story or seizing early control of the narrative. Because the cultivar entered public awareness already branded, packaged, and tied to specific people, it developed structural legitimacy immediately. It was not discovered, it was deployed. That single structural distinction is the reason Runts sits inside this top 10 list and why its lineage remains uncontested in a marketplace where many best-selling strains have disputed or fabricated histories. The creation of Runts only becomes fully understandable when each parent cultivar is broken down into its functional contributions, not just in name, but in the chemical, structural, and behavioral traits that transfer directly into the offspring. Skittles did not enter the breeding pool as a novelty strain. It was already recognized for producing unusually high concentrations of volatile sweet terpenes at a time when most commercial genetics still leaned on musk, earth, or gas-driven aroma signatures. The sensory tone of Skittles rivaled processed fruit candy in both aroma concentration and flavor persistence, and this was not accidental. Its terpene output regularly displayed elevated limonene, supported by secondary compounds that enhanced perceived sweetness without relying on the fuel-associated terpenes that dominated the 2000s commercial landscape. Skittles also carried a distinct visual identity. Under controlled temperatures and nutrient balances, it developed violet and lavender pigmentation while maintaining bright green calyx surfaces, which helped it stand out in cured flower form without needing artificial photography adjustments. Structurally, Skittles was not a production-friendly plant on its own. It required careful environmental dialing, tended to produce looser flower formations, and did not consistently reach the THC ceilings demanded by premium pricing tiers. Gelato, the second parent, represented the opposite end of the genetic requirement. It came from a breeding lineage obsessed with structure, resin density, and consistent chemical potency. Gelato created thickly layered calyx stacks, high trichome density, and resin heads with strong mechanical integrity during harvest and post-processing. It did not collapse under trimming, did not shed resin under handling, and routinely tested over 20% THC even before full environmental optimization. The cookies-derived structure behind Gelato matured within 8 to 9 weeks indoors and displayed minimal stretch, allowing high-density planting without sacrificing light penetration or airflow, which is directly tied to crop value in commercial indoor canopies. Gelato also contributed the creamy, dessert-style aromatic undertones that were already gaining traction among buyers who wanted cannabis that no longer resembled the hash plant and diesel lines of earlier generations. Where Skittles introduced the fruit candy profile, Gelato introduced the velvety backend of sweet dough and soft vanilla, creating a layered terpene environment instead of a single dominant note. This mattered scientifically because multi-note terpene arrangements increase perceived aroma saturation without requiring higher total terpene weight. When these two cultivars were combined, the breeding objective was not experimental curiosity. The goal was to pull forward the confectionery terpene dominance of Skittles while hardwiring it to the yield stability, trichome density, and potency reliability of Gelato. That is why Runts emerged with dense, sugar-crusted surfaces instead of airy floral structures. It inherited the resin productivity of Gelato and the chromatic variability of Skittles, creating a flower that displayed vivid coloration while retaining firmness and weight, which increased gram per square foot value in legal indoor rooms. The hybrid also fixed one of Skittles' commercial weaknesses: inconsistent THC ceilings. Runts repeatedly tests within the 20% plus band because Gelato's chemical stability overwrote the volatility Skittles sometimes produced. This advancement made Runts viable as a flagship cultivar in licensed markets, where potency data determines shelf placement. Every trait that now defines Runts, its instantly recognizable candy aromatics, its crystallized trichome shell, its short flowering cycle, its ability to go directly into cured flower, pre-roll, and solventless SQs without separate strain cultivation, originates from the precise pairing of these two parents. Nothing about the result was accidental. The lineage was selected to create a cultivar that performed like Gelato when grown, smelled like Skittles when cured, photographed like both when packaged, and tested within the potency and terpene thresholds required for top-tier positioning in the regulated cannabis economy. Runts altered the commercial environment of regulated cannabis by forcing the market to accept that sensory identity, chemical verification, and visual presentation could merge into a single product format that would outperform legacy strain categories built only on potency or cultural familiarity. Before Runts, cultivars rose to prominence through long-term adoption cycles, traditionally requiring years of grower refinement, word-of-mouth distribution, and gradual menu penetration before reaching statewide or national recognition. Runts skipped that maturation curve and demonstrated that a cultivar engineered for high terpene output, stable THC ceilings, compact flower structure, and photogenic presentation could anchor entire product lines from launch without requiring slow organic diffusion. Its cured flower profile consistently displayed frost-dense calyxes, concentrated candy-forward aromatics, and THC readings in the commercial sweet spot for adult-use retail, which allowed purchasing teams to list it as a flagship SKU without risk of consumer backlash. The terpene composition, dominated by bright, volatile compounds layered over resin-heavy trichome coverage, created an aroma intensity that translated even inside sealed packaging, a critical advantage in markets where customers cannot physically handle flower before purchase. Once placed on shelves, Runts began reshaping buyer expectations. Retail analytics from multiple legal jurisdictions confirmed sustained high-volume turnover in the premium and mid-premium price bands, rather than bargain tiers, proving that consumers were willing to purchase on measurable attributes such as potency and aroma density when the visual and brand identity supported the perceived value. That outcome influenced wholesale behavior. Cultivators who previously rotated through multiple strains per cycle began shifting space toward Runts runs because extraction labs, pre-roll manufacturers, and premium flower retailers all reported consistent sell-through windows, reducing financial risk. In extraction, the high terpene saturation allowed solventless processors to produce rosin with vivid flavor retention, increasing the number of downstream SKUs tied to a single cultivar. In pre-roll manufacturing, dense flower structure minimized degradation during grinding and filling, making runts more profitable than genetics that produce airy, low-resin material. The cultivar's entry also changed how branding firms and licensed operators approached naming, packaging, and product photos. High-definition macro imagery became a core marketing tool because runts consistently displayed trichome coverage and pigmentation that photographed accurately without digital enhancement. That reliability pushed dispensaries into a new visual economy where appearance and laboratory data were expected to align. Runts became the benchmark for that alignment. THC readings in the low to high 20s were not extraordinary on their own, but when paired with terpene loads above long-term industry averages and a cured flower appearance that communicated those metrics visually, it established a new commercial baseline. After Runts, cultivars lacking distinctive aroma identity, stable higher-end potency, and camera-ready presentation lost competitive ground, even if they held historical significance. The profile of Runts proved that in a fully regulated marketplace where lab data, packaging, and visual branding exist side by side, the cultivars that survive are those engineered to satisfy all categories at once rather than dominating only one. Once Runts achieved documented dominance in licensed flower sales and became a fixture across digital menus, a new layer of market behavior emerged that can be described as copy brand genetics, where the commercial value of a name detached from its original genotype and began circulating as a standalone asset. Packaging suppliers, many operating outside the regulatory infrastructure, started offering pre-printed bags, jars, and labels carrying the Runts logo and related imagery without any relationship to the original breeders or their verified cuts. This created a supply chain in which brand identity could be purchased independently of plant material. Growers with no access to the authentic lineage or with no interest in maintaining genetic integrity could fill these containers with unrelated hybrids, land races, or even mid-tier material and still present the product as Runts to consumers. In unregulated and semi-regulated environments, this practice became widespread enough that laboratory analysts in multiple jurisdictions began reporting terpene and cannabinoid profiles sold under the Runts name that bore no resemblance to the expected chemotype. Instead of limonene forward candy profiles paired with high 20s THC, test results showed divergent terpene stacks and potency ranges anywhere from mid-teens to low 20s. That discrepancy highlighted a structural problem. The retail interface treated Runts as a symbol, but the underlying chemistry had fragmented into dozens of unrelated expressions. In legal markets with stringent testing and seed-to-sale tracking, regulators responded by reinforcing rules against mislabeling and deceptive branding, reminding licensees that strain names function as representations of content and not just aesthetic choices. Some states began auditing menus and packaging more closely, comparing laboratory results to house strain descriptions, and calling out operators whose supposed Runts batches consistently deviated from known data ranges. Even in those systems, however, the economic incentive to attach product to a top-performing name remained strong. Wholesale buyers could demand higher prices from downstream retailers by attaching the label to any high THC hybrid, while retailers could justify premium retail tags and faster turns by populating their inventory lists with Runts-branded options. This behavior propagated through gray market channels as well, with social media sellers, informal delivery services, and unlicensed storefronts, all capitalizing on the same recognition effect. From an educational standpoint, the Runts phenomenon demonstrated how quickly brand inflation can outpace genetic integrity when analytics, compliance, and consumer literacy fail to move together. Once the name began generating outsized demand, variant labels appeared in rapid succession. White Runts, Pink Runts, Black Runts, Rainbow Runts, Obama Runts, Lemon Cherry Runts, and more, many of them lacking transparent breeding records or verifiable parent lines. Some represented legitimate phenotype selections or related crosses, while others functioned as simple rebranding exercises that borrowed color adjectives or political references to capture attention. The expansion of these sublabels intensified the signal-to-noise problem. Consumers attempting to build personal experience around a specific cultivar identity could no longer assume that two bags with Runts-based naming purchased in different stores, cities, or platforms contained similar material. For breeders working within professional standards, this environment devalued the work of stabilizing a line because any chemical profile could be surfaced under the same word. For regulators and analysts, it provided a live case study of how high-demand cultivars create secondary markets in packaging and naming, and how that secondary market can undermine both quality assurance and consumer trust. Runts, more than earlier popular strains, revealed that once a cultivar crosses a certain popularity threshold in a data-visible, brand-conscious era, the name becomes a commodity traded independently of the plant, and the market must decide whether to anchor value to lab-verifiable genetics or continue rewarding whatever product can be wrapped in the most familiar logo. In the years following the rise of Runts, the structure of legal cannabis markets shifted toward a narrow fixation on THC percentages printed on certificates of analysis, and that shift has quietly pushed cultivars built on balanced chemistry and saturated aroma out of the top decision tier. Retail systems in many jurisdictions now sort digital menus, wholesale spreadsheets, and in-store listings by reported THC first, with terpene content either left off labels entirely or relegated to fine print that most buyers never see. This indexing logic changed how producers, laboratories, and purchasing managers behave. Producers operating under thin margins began selecting genetics not for total aromatic complexity, but for their ability to repeatedly test at the upper edge of what the testing environment would support. That meant prioritizing lines that could show inflated THC values under aggressive cultivation, post-harvest handling, and lab relationships willing to tolerate or enable optimistic results. Laboratories competing for client retention in crowded markets faced pressure to deliver numbers that would keep large growers and brands from migrating to rival facilities. Some responded by maximizing every variable that could raise reported THC, from dry-down targeting that pushes moisture content to the lowest allowable threshold, to calculation methods that convert THCA to THC in ways that present the highest possible figure within regulatory formulas. The outcome of this combined behavior is a commercial environment where a cultivar that consistently registers at 29 or 30% THC, even with mediocre terpene output, can secure better shelf space and higher wholesale prices than a cultivar in the low 20s, with exceptional aromatic density and nuanced profile. For cultivars like Runts, engineered to deliver a harmonized relationship between terpene saturation, visual structure, and strong but not artificially inflated potency, this evolution has consequences. Growers who once dedicated entire rooms to Runts, runs because the flower moved quickly at premium tiers, now face buyers asking a single question before anything else: what does it test at? If a new line designed for maximum THC can be pushed on paper to 32 or 33% with acceptable yields, purchasing teams often assign it priority regardless of how thin its terpene spectrum may be. Over repeated cycles, this incentive structure strips the genetic portfolio of depth, lines selected for top-end cannabinoid readings, especially when combined with aggressive fertigation and high-intensity lighting strategies aimed solely at THC output often exhibit flatter aromatic profiles. They may still express one or two dominant terpenes in measurable amounts, but the layered complexity that made earlier dessert hybrids memorable is less prevalent. Flowers can look frosty, test high, and yet deliver muted or generic aroma when opened. The more the system rewards that outcome, the more breeders and producers abandon cultivars, whose primary advantage lies in multi-dimensional scent and flavor rather than headline THC. This also changes how new consumers build their internal map of quality. A generation entering the market under a THC-only regime receives a steady stream of messaging from menus, influencers, and bud tender scripts, reinforcing the idea that numbers above 30 equal superiority. They are rarely shown side-by-side comparisons of high THC, low terp cultivars versus slightly lower THC, high terp cultivars in a way that highlights sensory richness over raw potency digits. As a result, their memory of what cannabis can be becomes narrower. They know the sharp, fast, sometimes harsh profile of THC-driven flower, but have little exposure to the layered candy or dessert spectrum that cultivars like Runts once delivered as a standard rather than an exception. For producers who still maintain Runts and similar lines in their catalog, this market conditioning forces difficult decisions. Keeping those cultivars in rotation often means accepting lower positions on digital menus, reduced margins, or the need to reframe the products through limited drops and specialty branding just to maintain attention. Many simply remove them from regular production schedules and reserve them for a small batch, direct-to-consumer programs where education and context can be delivered alongside the product. The THC metric chase also reshapes post-harvest practices in ways that directly impact aroma and flavor. Extended drying aimed at squeezing out moisture to hit lower water activity thresholds can intensify cannabinoid readings on paper while volatilizing or degrading some of the more delicate terpene fractions that defined earlier dessert hybrids. Overly aggressive curing or storage conditions chosen for shelf life objectives rather than sensory preservation further flatten the profile. When this becomes the dominant approach across a region, cultivars built to showcase complex terpene architectures no longer display the characteristics that once made them stand out. They are chemically capable of depth, but the system they move through is tuned to preserve and advertise THC at the expense of full-spectrum expression. In that environment, Runts and other terpene-centered cultivars begin to look like relics from a brief period when markets were still willing to balance potency, aroma, and visual appeal as co-equal indicators of value, rather than allowing a single number on a lab report to dictate what survives on the shelf. What we have uncovered across this breakdown is not a nostalgia piece about a single cultivar, but a structural map showing how commercial language, laboratory reporting, and controlled access to information have reshaped what the public is allowed to understand about cannabis. When a cultivar like Runts can be created with documented lineage, quantifiable chemistry, and visible impact on purchasing behavior, yet still be replaced in market priority by plants selected only for exaggerated THC values, it exposes how the industry's communication channels are designed to redirect attention away from full-spectrum understanding and toward single-number metrics that create predictable sales funnels. The deeper one looks into verified chemotype data, terpene architecture, and the economic behavior of regulated markets. The clearer it becomes that most consumers are not being shown the whole plant. They are being handed simplified language, algorithm-sorted menus, and potency-first sales logic that discourages investigation. Behind these simplified interfaces sit paywalled databases, restricted market analytics, and genetic records that require either direct industry access or subscription-based entry points to analyze. When journalists and researchers attempt to decode these systems, they often encounter barriers built not from Prohibition-era ideology, but from modern commercial interest. The effect is the same. A public that cannot see past strain names and THC percentages has no path to informed selection, no matter how many legal states appear on the map. The cannabis plant itself has never been more measurable. Modern laboratories generate complete terpene signatures, minor cannabinoid breakdowns, moisture content, residual solvent detection, heavy metal analysis, and water activity curves. Breeders can trace lineage, phenotype stability, and morphological expression over multiple generations. Yet, the language reaching consumers remains intentionally narrow, positioning potency as the entire story and reducing chemical nuance to marketing tags. This is not an accident. It is a commercial filtration system. If the public understood why a 22% cultivar with a 3% terpene load may deliver a deeper sensory experience than a 32% cultivar with a flat terpene profile, the entire pricing structure and shelf hierarchy of modern dispensaries would have to shift. Instead, the industry leans on simplified data points and opaque terminology, sustaining a knowledge gap that keeps buyers in a passive position. Meanwhile, the real research continues to move forward in universities, private analytical labs, and breeding programs that have already started cataloging the dimensional language of the plant in ways that make the THC-only framework look antiquated. This research is factual, reproducible, and measurable. It proves that cannabis cannot be reduced to a single axis without destroying its cultural, chemical, and therapeutic complexity. The more we look without filtering our view through retail metrics and advertising language, the more we find the plant is still speaking a language of layered compounds, inherited structures, and sensory intelligence that predates every modern labeling convention. Thank you for tuning in to Canna Intel 420, where we continue to decode that language without relying on marketing shortcuts or recycled talking points. The work is ongoing. The information is there for anyone willing to push past artificial barriers, subscription gates, and one-dimensional THC narratives. The plant has never been silent. It simply requires a vocabulary that the commercial system is not incentivized to teach. Again, thank you for watching and supporting Canna Intel 420. Everything discussed here is for educational purposes only. Always follow the cannabis laws in your state, province, or tribal jurisdiction. Do not purchase, possess, or consume cannabis where it is prohibited, and only buy from licensed sources where it is legal to do so. Nothing in this video is medical advice, and we do not make claims about health outcomes. If you choose to consume cannabis, do it responsibly, keep it away from minors, and respect your community's regulations. Research widely, question everything, and never let a label or a percentage tell the whole story.